that means we can start. So just, to tell you what we're going to do today, and I can see that this is not working. Okay, we're going to be talking very briefly, when I say briefly, it's not going to be brief, about class today, but this is something we're going to do after we've sort of gone through the questions that you had for the Kingsmen, because we haven't really managed to kind of go through and discuss them in this case. But then we're going to be talking about, what kind of England is being presented within these movies. And of course, we're going to be talking about the question of class, which is pretty prevalent in the Kingsman franchise, although we'll just be talking about the first Kingsman movie in this case. Okay, anyone who wants to start concerning, and I'm just going to open one of the scene analyses in a moment. This will be this one. Okay, maybe let's get started. Again, we're not going to go through the analyses as such, but we'll be talking about mostly the question of heritage film, yes, no, and which kind of national identity do these movies present, or the first one in particular. And of course, we are also going to be talking about class, but that is something we're going to be doing later on. So let's get started with heritage film. Can the Secret Service, the Kingsmen, the Secret Service, be considered a heritage film, yes or no? What goes for and what goes against such a reading of the Kingsmen? Yes.
Well, we have, on the one hand, we have the dark colors. So we have the second scene where there's dialogue in that room, and the room is pretty dark with this green, and I don't know, I think there was some brown in there as well, which I always associate with English colors, because it's
okay.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I was in so many rooms where they have the kind of same color palette, so I think those dark saturated colors are 1.4 the heritage film, and also that they are wearing the suits.
Yep. Okay.
And also that they have some long shots in between. There are some close-ups, but there are also long shots, and long shots are mostly of which are used in heritage films.
Yeah. Okay, so the editing and the camera work can be, maybe not the editing, but certainly the camera work can in parts be considered on the pro side when it comes to heritage films. Yes, absolutely. Just adding the no. Anyone else? Yes.
I think also that their code names, like Merlin and so, are based on like legends.
Yeah.
Or other thing.
The code names. It's the Arthurian legends, so to speak. So we have a reference to myths and legends that are particularly British, English, one of the two. Yeah? What else? Yes.
Well, I would say since these Kingsmen are like this upper class secret society spy thing, they also like present this posh image of British people. I think we dress in suits every day, and yeah, like they do. But yeah, also a little bit like this James Bond thing, but a little different.
A little bit like it and a little bit different, yes. Just going to write down James Bond. And the upper class focus. Yep. Yes.
I don't really know on which side to put this argument on, but what I was thinking about, it has some really distinct social critique, I think, in this persona of the very classist guy in the training that in the end doesn't make it. I don't remember his name. In the second
Charlie.
film, he has this metal arm.
Yeah, it's Charlie.
Yeah. And I think he's a very distinct social critic in his character, criticizing this upper class focus, what it produces in a younger generation, what entitlement, and also what negative qualities, in contrast to, so then showing that a person from a non-traditional background in this context embodies better values than what is produced by this upper class mentality. And I do think that is a distinct social critique, what growing up with money does to a young person. And I do think that, I don't know on which side I would put it, maybe in the middle, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what do I call this kind of bullet point? Charlie? Social critique?
Maybe?
Okay.
I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm not sure.
Let's call it class critique. Or, we'll get to that. It's kind of because the movie, and I would absolutely agree that there is a very particular kind of class critique that the movie provides simply by contrasting Charlie and Eggsy, who is kind of the, I think especially in that scene where the train kind of runs him over, Eggsy just screams, "Fuck you," while Charlie basically proceeds to tell him everything. And I would argue, yes, it's a class critique because the movie kind of makes this point for a meritocracy that, you can have this sort of upward mobility, class mobility, because of your merits and your character rather than your class position, because in the end it is Eggsy who kind of succeeds in this sort of avenue, and it becomes a Kingsman instead of, all those upper class boys of the old boys network in a way that were portrayed in the beginning. Yes. What else? Yes.
Normally in heritage films, there are not really one main focus on one character.
Yeah.
But here it kind of is an Eggsy. Of course, we have so many characters in the training, for example, but there's still this main focus, the camera following him and anyone else.
Yep. I think you had raised your hand, but not quite sure whether we've covered that already.
I want to say that they have very ideal picture of how a person should behave, so they are really focused on manners and this picture of an English gentleman.
Yeah.
They should be like.
How I put that in the middle. I'll just do that like so. Hopefully that works. So you have the gentleman. I'll put that in commas. I think Professor Kuhn usually called that a man of independent means, and this is sort of what this film also portrays, men of independent means. We don't quite know how they actually get their money, whether they're being paid for their spy work, because especially the prequel that came out this year, I think, or last year, that kind of makes the point of they are servants and they are not exactly upper class people, but they have their day job, so to speak. Well, we don't quite know what Merlin does or what Galahad or Harry Hart does. We simply see them be Kingsmen, but we don't see their day-to-day job. So he could be a factory worker for all we know, because we don't frankly know. But I think the film doesn't really go too much into detail because it wants to portray this idea of the proper English gentleman with, manners maketh man. I think that has become this sort of headlining quote by the film, and I think this is a particular focus that could be considered a heritage, a certain kind of 19th century heritage also. Yes?
So I have 1 point for no and 1 point for yes.
Okay.
The no point would be, of course we have the upper class focus, but in the beginning there's also the focus on the lower class because of Eggsy and where he lives. And because of his family.
Yeah.
And the yes point would be that the house's dimensions are always portrayed
Mm-hmm.
when they go into the suit maker shop.
Yeah.
For example, the whole house is portrayed, or the training house.
Yeah.
Also a big mansion where we have this long shot.
Absolutely. Also, I would, and I'm going to simply briefly show you a scene, or not a scene, just the establishing shot, so to speak. Let's briefly go through. You can see it's a lot of quotes. All right. And if we look at that particular shot in the beginning, of course, you know, no, sorry. Yes, we will be the best of friends, Mr. Valentine. And though it isn't really heritage objects, you know, in the beginning we said it's the mise en scène, and the heritage objects are very particular objects with, I don't know, the lights and the wallpapers and so on and so forth being portrayed. But what you see here is, and I just need to switch so that everyone else can see it. What you see here is a particular, of course, a particular class focus, but also I would argue particular kinds of heritage objects, not in the sense that we saw in Emma, but there are certain kinds of heritage objects right here that are being portrayed by the sort of the ways of drinking or consuming alcohol. I'm not quite sure. Ah, there it is.
Yeah, also cigars on the other side.
Yeah, exactly, the cigars. And of course he's sitting in a black cap, and I think we see that even more interestingly, not here, but let's move through. And this is exactly sort of what wouldn't be out of place in a heritage movie in a way. Because what we see and what the camera usually also focuses on is of course the characters. But what we see here is a very elaborate kind of background. You have those huge paintings. I think the painting right behind Arthur is supposed to be the sort of inception figure, or the kind of first kind of Kingsman. I mean, that's obviously not Ralph Fiennes because the prequel came out far later than this one, but you have something that wouldn't look too out of place in those stately manners that we talked about in the beginning. You have those kind of small objects. You have, it's also very colonial objects, but that's just, you know, second comment. But you also have little statues. You have the sort of hunting equipment or the hunting statues. You have this really dark wallpaper. All of these things would definitely fit the bill of a heritage movie. Not all of them, because we also see, I think that's the same scene, we later on see Eggsy's home, which is definitely not in the same manner and in the same fashion. So what is portrayed here is also lovely. Is of course a more council housing that would definitely, and I would agree, the working class focus, especially when it comes to speciality or with spaces, doesn't really fit the bill of heritage movies, although there have been heritage movies like Brassed Off that have been considered non-traditional, but certainly part of heritage cinema. Okay, so I would absolutely agree, very long comment, but yes, we do see the manor houses and these stately homes that would definitely be part of that. Yes?
Just because we were talking about this specific scene, I just quickly had a thought and wanted to add it. What I do feel in the portrayal of the working class, the mother of Eggsy and his stepfather are such an interesting contrast, because the father, I think, does represent this stereotypical viewpoint of a heritage film that, like, morality is contained within the middle class, and we do have aristocracy that can be corrupt, but the middle class is like wholesome, and the underclass, yeah, I mean, they're unfortunate, but they're also sometimes wicked and things like that. And that he embodies that stereotype, like but then the mother, on the other hand, totally destroys the stereotype, because we see the humanity in her, even though she is part of the situation. She has a full characterization, I feel, and like she has this deep sadness, and it's just really tragic to see her. She's obviously just a good person in a bad situation, and I do feel that's such an interesting dichotomy of putting the stereotype next to an completely negation of a stereotype.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought that was very interesting in the portrayal of the working class, like, because we only get like few glimpses at the beginning, and it's interesting that they choose this limited time to use it in this contrast.
Yeah, I would also argue that what we start off from is a huge departure from what we see in this scene. You know, you see the flat and it's kind of messy and the furniture is kind of run down. I'm not quite sure if I still have it open, but yeah, it's still open. So what you see here is, of course, it's very messy. There's a lot of like children's toys. There is a lot of stuff on the table. The curtains are kind of, I mean, they are yellow, probably just the color, but they also feel like really old and have already yellowed over the years. You have baby photos. You have a lot of alcohol, funnily enough. So there's talking about stereotype. You know, his stepfather is obviously, he's drinking. I think we see that in that scene too. If I can find the cursor, I can also show you. Give me a sec. So, buy yourself some sweets. Okay, not here, unfortunately, but you definitely see there is this particular kind of mess. You see alcohol in a number of shots. You also have the pub as sort of, and that comes right here, so you have the council housing, and of course you have the pub as the sort of meeting and breeding ground of these very much working class masculinities that are sort of, that revolve around certain places, that revolve around violence, alcohol, etc., etc. So you have that stereotype. In the beginning, however, I would argue we start off with a particular kind of middle class background in some form, because when Harry Hart first visits Eggsy's mum to tell her about the death of her husband, the flat looks much cleaner. It's very, I don't want to call it chic, but it's certainly from the time, I think it's the 1990s or something, it looks very much like a proper, maybe lower middle class, but certainly kind of aspirational middle class home. She is dressed really prettily. The clothes are in good quality. Her hair is made up. She's dressed up. She has makeup on. It's a very different feel that we start off in the beginning. Also, with regards to with regard to the children, when you see Eggsy for the first time, he's dressed properly. I think he has even a little shirt on with a sweater over it. But his sister, for instance, we never heard, I think it's her sister, maybe it could be a brother, I'm not quite sure, because her name is never named. But she is in a much worse position. So her clothes are kind of always dirty, they're always stained. It's this very different point that these two children kind of start off from, but it's also where we start off. So in the beginning you have this aspiration to, that could be middle class, also sort of symbolized by his father, who is part of the Kingsmen, who has worked his way up, but then he sacrifices himself. He is this really morally good kind of person that Eggsy tries to follow in his footsteps, but his stepfather is the complete opposite. He is the sort of the chef that you see in certain movies where working class is portrayed as predatory, as violent, as, you know, constantly drinking. Also, with his friends, it seems to be like he's in some sort of gang, or he's some sort of gang leader. So it's kind of, you have this box and you shove every stereotype you have in it, and then that's it. So that's his stepfather, and that's, of course, you know, needed in some form to actually, as you so said, to break with these stereotypes, to show that these people aren't necessarily contained by their class position, for instance. Okay. What else concerning heritage films, yes or no? Anything that we could add? Yes?
I wouldn't say that it's slow paced because it has a lot of action scenes that are like very quick.
Thinking of the church scene? Yeah, that's not exactly languid editing. Yeah? Okay, that goes on the no side, the editing. Interesting. Yes?
I just wanted to add what I find interesting is this aspect of the animals, like being taught that this dichotomy of a gentleman never hurts an animal intentionally, and then their whole examination is shooting a dog or being supposed to shoot a dog. So I think that is very interesting, and I even would put it on the yes side. I believe like this. How do we treat animals humanely? Like this enlightenment tinged aspect of we have to support every individuality and not hurt the animals and we eat meat, but it's fine, and but don't shoot your dog.
It's also interesting that, you know, the gentleman does what is necessary if it's asked of him, so he will potentially shoot the dog, not knowing whether it's actually a live round or not. I like the inclusion of the dogs. It's kind of very interesting. I also love it's a bulldog. It's not a bulldog. It will grow, right? And she just goes like, nope. You have chosen the pug. So yes, it's also an interesting thing that everyone else chooses a hunting dog, you know, or a German shepherd, and he just comes out with the pug, which is it kind of highlights the differences between him and the others again. Maybe kind of slightly moving on to the question of not of heritage but of national identity. What kind of national identity do we find here? Particularly British, particularly English?
Well, I would say it's more English because I would say, I'm not really sure about that, but I think he's living in London, in the suburbs of London. It would be more English than British.
Okay, yeah. What about the others? It's interesting that you say London, and that's more kind of English. I mean, capital city, but also this weird kind of globalization going on in London, so it's kind of a mixed bag. But I would go with your argument of that it is a particular English kind.
Yeah, if you would live really in the city, in a wealthy part, then it would be, of course, more international. I would say, because they also have some different values and it's more mixed. But because it's not, that's why I would say it's more of an English perspective.
So you have a closer tie of the working class, so to speak, to Englishness, as well as probably also the upper classes goes much better, or not much better, but certainly goes well together with Englishness. Yeah.
I would also say that it's rather Englishness, but I think it's a little contradictory because this stereotype of the British gentleman. I mean, you of the name you would think it's British, but it's usually just associated with England. I think, I think every part has some different tropes in movies usually. Like, you don't usually have for example, Scottish person as portraying this British gentleman, but they rather have stereotypically this Highlander mindset thing going on. So I would also say it's rather English than British.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
And in addition, what also is I'm not sure if it goes into the direction of national identity, but I think somehow that we have this split in society that is very dominant in this movie, I would say, because we have the working class exi who comes into this high society, upper class organization thing.
So the class difference as a constituting feature of English/British national identity, yeah. Yes.
Maybe it's also a little tied to the city of London, because you have this historical Stadtzentrum thing.
City center?
Yeah. With Buckingham Palace and British Museum and all of that stuff. And then you have these suburban suburbs words, like these more poorer suburbs where also tourists usually don't really visit, but it's
Not quite,
still
no.
like there, and,
Mm.
and we have this city difference.
Mhm.
Really.
Yeah, absolutely. What about the others? English, British, none of it? Hmm.
I don't know what the points I mentioned. Those were the points I was mainly focused on while watching the film, because I do have to admit I watched the film like a lot.
Okay.
It's like my, I don't think, seventh viewing or something for this class. So I really watched it a lot. So these 2 points I mentioned before, the class critique and this treatment of animals, was something that I picked up in my most recent viewing. But I would say in the general term, it's just these two really stick out for me thematically. So I don't think these aspects are particularly, I don't know, maybe they are English, or like especially the class critique with England, like the north of England versus the south of England. It is very prevalent. I mean, in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South,
Yeah,
for example,
exactly.
so it is there.
Mhm.
And it's particularly English, I would say, but
Mhm.
overall, this stereotype or these national identities within like the UK is always very interesting, because somehow this void of Britishness has to be filled with something, because it's not really, they are very distinct identities, so what will connect them? And I do feel that it's at the moment not that much. So, and this feeling of individuals and so on, it's, yeah, I don't know. So I would say it's just what is prevalent thematically, also at this discussion, what is even Britishness.
I think what unites all of them is a particular hatred for Boris Johnson. Maybe that's a nice way of uniting it. All right, just to kind of sum that up, I would absolutely agree that we don't quite see a British national identity. Simply, I mean, you could argue that we have this kind of, the empire is coming back to roost in a way, with the American villain. Of course it's an American, because they obviously didn't have any Germans any longer. They can't take a British person because, so it's of course an American. Also in the second movie it's also an American. And in the first one it's a Scotsman. So, okay, so we have this kind of idea of a colonial, or of colonies coming back to kind of try and supersede and kind of replace England as, you know, the former colonial power. But again, England of course defeats these kinds of or the identities that might become stronger, because Valentine stands for a particular kind of, not national identity, but certainly a very capitalistic, neoliberal kind of identity, where everything is, you know, having some kind of economic power is far more important than having a very strong American, for instance, identity, although you can consider him very much American, because apart from the fact that he can't shoot a gun because he can't see blood, but you have these kinds of harking back to these Bond villains, for instance, and I think they address that at some point in the movie, where Harry Hart says that he really liked those old Bond movies, those old spy movies, of which the Kingsmen is both one of them, but also an homage to these movies. And they do talk about the villain and the hero, so to speak. And Valentine sits very much in between those identities, is simply seen as a threat without a very clear-cut national identity that, you know, the other needs to be defined against. However, the English are in this case very well defined through exactly what we saw here, you know, the stately mansions, the countryside to a certain degree, mostly London, but also through class difference. It's a very particular kind of Englishness that we're being shown there. Yes?
I also find it interesting that it's an adaptation of a comic. So a British comic, it also has the sense of like a British producer or British artist tackling a very Americanized genre in a sense. So creating something distinctly British or English in contrast to this Americanized genre and this American villain and things like that. So I think
Absolutely.
That's also an interesting aspect.
Yes, absolutely. It is an adaptation of a comic. Very good point. I did have a comment I wanted to make while you were talking, but I completely lost it. Anyways, that's not a problem. But yes, no, let's go back for a second. I don't know, I completely lost track. It's Tuesday morning and that always happens. Let me briefly, yes, we were talking, or I was talking about the question of heritage. So just from the fact that we listed quite a number of things on the yes side, you would agree that this is a form of a heritage film? More than the others we've watched. Interesting, okay. Right, why? Okay, you're shaking your head. Everyone else is kind of going, yeah, sure, I would agree with that. I'd be really interesting because I thought, and this is something I haven't, it's not scripted, but I had really thought you would go more into the direction of Austenland or, for instance, of Hot Fuzz, because Hot Fuzz, in comparison, sure, it's a funny movie, sure, it's this weirdly buddy cop comedy, it's very Americanized, we did talk about it, but it is far more obviously English than the Kingsmen is, in my opinion at least. So I'd be interested in hearing your take on that. Why is it the Kingsmen that goes for that is definitely some form of heritage film, while the others didn't so much? I mean, it's obviously not just the editing and the camera work. Yeah.
Well, for me, it's kind of hard to find some no points because for me it was a long time since I watched the whole movie. But we have all those facts listed, and I don't really know many more no facts because maybe the yes facts are sticking out more.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I also have in my mind the other two films in this series, which are also very English and British. Also the last film, the newest film which came out, where they are fighting against the Russian and so on, which is also very British what is being shown. So with the soldier and so on. So that's why I have more the yes side in my head. But I also would say I don't agree 100% that it is a heritage film, because there are so many things which are normally not in a heritage film. So that's always like, yeah, kind of, but so,
okay.
I think of course there are some films and series where I would definitely say, yeah, in a split second it's a heritage film. For example, Downton Abbey, I would say, yeah, sure. And that's what my image is in my head, like, there's a heritage film, and then I compare it with the other potential films, so
okay.
and so on.
Okay, yeah.
I could take the against point at the moment, but what I think why it maybe could feel like a heritage film for many people is like this James Bond aesthetic thing. I think, like this British gentleman, upper class, people in suits thing. I know I'm going like crazy with my words. But I don't know, for me this one is too much of an action movie, I think.
Okay.
It is like, also, I don't know if that's an actual point or if that's just my personal preference, but it's very bloody at the end.
Oh, is it?
Somehow, for me, that doesn't fit that much into a heritage film. I also, maybe that is just like my weird mind, but somehow British heritage films for me are usually like, they feel old. Like Downton Abbey or like Emma is a clear heritage film in my opinion, but it's like this, I don't want to say cottagecore again, but like this it's somewhere not in the city, but rather in the rural area, and you have this like poor aristocracy thing going on. I don't know, for me, just the Jane Austen stuff feels like a heritage movie, Downton Abbey feels like heritage movie, and honestly, of the ones we've watched, I actually feel like Lord of the Rings is the closest to a heritage movie in my opinion. But maybe it's also this like Middle Earth, it's like also this country and like medieval feeling.
Okay.
It like feels old again, and I know I said that one's pretty bloody, and then I say something of Lord of the Rings, I know, but somehow this feels different.
You don't see blood splatter in Lord of the Rings unless it's orc blood and then it's kind of black or has a different consistency or something. So you don't see and here I'm going to refer to the church scene again. This is not what you see in Lord of the Rings. I mean, it would have made it probably even better, but generally not sure. Yeah.
Also, maybe the difference for me is also that here it's like people getting murdered, and in Lord of the Rings it's mostly orcs.
All right, nameless, faceless orcs.
No mercy for the orcs.
Yeah, exactly.
But orcs are like monsters, they're crazy, and they're well.
All right, yeah, they're very much dehumanized. So it's okay if Aragorn slaughters 15 orcs. If those were elves, we would definitely react differently to that, potentially, unless you don't like elves. Anyways, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like at the very beginning of what you just said, you said it's the same genre as like James Bond, and I do feel that that is the entry point of how I view it in the view of heritage film like this, the upper classiness and this James Bond. But it's interesting because it is also campy, I feel. So it is with all the blood, it knows it is an exaggerated portrayal of this kind of genre. I mean the pointer of all the scenes with the bad guys that he has to barf. I mean it's supposed to be seen as a parody, as funny, but it's still part of the genre, I feel. But it's just not as over the top as like Austin Powers or something. It's more realistic than Austin Powers because it has these serious tones also, but it also has the campy, exaggerated blood and hail Satan and have a lovely afternoon kind of vibe. So I think it is part of the genre, and that's how I see it as an heritage but it is self-aware. I would say.
Yeah, exactly. It is a spy movie. It is a very James Bondy movie, but it is also first aware of it, that it is trying or taking parts of the genre and completely turning it on its head, like the villain barfing after every time he shot someone or he sees blood. That is not something you expect from a James Bond movie. This is where it kind of goes back to Hot Fuzz, because Hot Fuzz is also very self-aware, though in a completely different manner. You know, you remember the one-liner where, you know, these genre conventions are being used in a particular manner to create humor. And in this case, it is also used to create humor, because every time, and maybe that's just a personal thing, but every time Valentine goes like, no, I can't look at it, please clean them up, I do go, okay. Or when he has the I think the dinner scene with Harry Hart, and he opens up those silver plates and it's McDonald's underneath. So it kind of uses the conventions, you know, the villain and the hero talking to one another. And it is, and I would argue that Valentine, and this is where the comedy aspect doesn't really work any longer, he is a threatening villain. They have done a very good job in portraying him both as kind of a joke of a villain, but also in a particular threatening manner. So you never have the feeling that he's just a buffoon, but you do get that there is a particular threat, a very good or a very sort of a threatening threat. That sounds weird, but that he is a danger, not just to England, to Britain, but to those people involved in the entire Kingsman operation, but also worldwide. And you see the effects he has. So that doesn't make him exactly an idiot, although he is kind of portrayed in the beginning as such, but he is also a very good villain in this case. Yeah.
From because you mentioned the McDonald's food. Of course, it's an adaptation, a modern one.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, you have some modern things in there as
Mm-hmm.
McDonald's because, yeah, it's just you can't really, for that scene particularly, you can't really do it in another time period
Mm-hmm.
and do the same kind of joke,
Mm-hmm.
I would say. So, they are not really just James Bond because it's more in nowadays time and really kind of realistic.
Mm.
Of course, everyone sometimes eats McDonald's, so I think that's why they put it in there as well.
Mm. I mean, the recent James Bond movies, and I think in particular Skyfall, which came out roughly at the same time, I think, especially Skyfall, is a very old-timey feeling James Bond in some form. It's a colleague of mine always said that he didn't like the psychologization of James Bond, where he has the tragic backstory. Of course, this is part of Skyfall, but Skyfall, especially with his portrayal of London, of Scotland, you know, he comes back to the Highlands, and there of course, there's this guy with a huge gun and he goes, "Welcome to Scotland," which I always love. But you have those long shots. You have a very a heritage movie kind of feel, going back to those old Bond movies in some form. Also a very personal threat to Bond, but that's just a second nature. But I would argue that both the Kingsman, the first one, as well as the Skyfall James Bond, they are very similar, both in setup, in the way they use certain genre conventions, etc., etc. However, again, Kingsman is of course just in homage to that. It does quote James Bond, but in a particular manner. And it's interesting that you all kind of pointed out it's gentleman, it's James Bond, it's upper class focus, that makes it very much heritage-alike. And I would, as you have, I believe, said, the class critique is also a big part of it. And the thing is, I do absolutely agree. This is the one that, and I shouldn't say that in, you know, academic discourse, but it feels the most like a heritage film, simply because it uses those conventions to such a degree that you always have the feeling that could be a spy movie of the 1960s, and you wouldn't notice it except for maybe some, you know, with the SIM cards and all the newer technology. But if you take the technology a step back, especially if you look at the armory when they first get into the tailor shop and he shows off the armory, it's umbrellas, it's kind of, it's the, what is it called, Feuerzeug?
Lighter.
Yes, thank you. What? I think it's still the heat outside yesterday and today. It just kind of fries my brain. But yes, you have the lighters, which are hand grenades. You have the pen, which is kind of, that is so James Bond to have this exploding pen, or the pen with poison. And you have the shoes that have those little spikes in it. So all of these, sorry?
I just said, I think the shoes are awesome. I just said, oh yeah, they're awesome.
Yeah. Absolutely, the Oxfords, of course, not the Brogues. But generally, you know, these things are used so much so that you could transport this movie into different time periods and it would still work if you take out certain things. So I would absolutely agree. It is very English on the one hand, and on the other hand, it is kind of a hybrid format of a heritage film, but one that feels and looks and sounds also the most heritage-like. What would also go into the yes direction is the solely British cast, or at least mostly British and English cast. You have Colin Firth, Taron Egerton, he's of course Welsh. So you have those regional identities being kind of united. You don't hear his Welsh accent, but he's speaking very thick Cockney dialect in this case. But you have Merlin, that is Mark Strong, you have Michael Caine. Those are not particularly heritage actors, you know, it's not Ray Fiennes or Helena Bonham Carter and so on and so forth, and it's not Kenneth Branagh, but they are known in England, but also internationally, of course, in this case. So you don't have this small time or this small scale acting ensemble that you usually find in heritage films, especially in older ones, but you have a purely British cast in this case, except for the villains in this case, or generally in this case. What else? Also with regard, and this is where we'll come to class in a moment, with regard to language, they all have a very proper RP kind of English. They do speak the Queen's English, except for Merlin to some degree. He's from the north, you can hear that. And Eggsy, who has this working class accent, again, and very thick Cockney in this case. Okay. Getting to the last kind of question that I also posed in a second, the question of the representation of class. Any comments concerning that? You had raised your hand, it's probably not about class.
No, I just had
Good.
a short question. Is
Yeah.
like this Cockney accent, is that like a basic film technique for showing that the person is working class? Because they also did it in My Fair Lady, I think.
Yeah, they also did it in Mary Poppins. Basically, I'm not quite sure whether it's one of the common techniques, but it's certainly one of the most prevalent. So every time you want to portray a proper working class background, you would probably go for Cockney, because this has been filmically, visually so often used, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, other movies that usually have their working class people being portrayed as Cockney speaking. You know, the chimney sweep who's very dirty and dances and talks to others, which have also a very thick Cockney accent. So yeah, that is used particularly often to denote a particular kind of working class. They could also use someone from the Midlands, or they could also use someone from, I don't know, the north of England, Manchester, some kind of working class area, but they often don't do that. They often use, weirdly enough, London Cockney accent. So it's commonly used most of the time. Because, you know, especially if you use someone from Manchester, I think the differentiation for someone on the outside, and we're not talking about a national audience here, but we mostly talk about an international audience. An international audience immediately cues on to the fact that one of them is working class. If you had two people from Manchester and they both speak, you know, their respective class dialects in a way, or framed class dialects, then the difference wouldn't be, you know, as large as you see with Harry Hart and Colin Firth speaking RP English and Taron Egerton actually speaking this kind of very thick working class accent. So it's mostly about creating differences, not so much in this case for a national audience, but for the international audience that immediately cues on to the fact that one of them is upper class, one of them is obviously from a lower class or a working class background. Yeah. So in this case, dialect would be one way of representing class in the movies. What else when we talk about class? Or should we talk about what is class and how is it kind of theoretically framed? Okay. Those of you that, yes?
Yeah, you can say yourself.
Okay. Have you ever had a class on class? No, not the Introduction to British Cultural Studies, I think, does it nowadays. Back in my day, it didn't. Okay, then I'll just, first of all, move back half of my presentation. Okay, so maybe it's a very good start to class. All right, so what do you already know about class? Let's start off with that. What's your starting point when it comes to not just theories of class, but definitions of class? If you had to define it for yourself or for someone else, how would you do that?
Well, what first comes to mind is how much money you have or how much money you earn, and with that there are certain standards you have. For example, you have a bigger house or you have a flat or something like that, and how you're being perceived, and what else? Yeah, it's kind of in that direction, and also how you dress, and what job you are, and through that how you're perceived.
Okay. Yeah.
For example, if you're a banker, you are differently perceived as if you're a baker, for example.
Mm-hmm. You also wear different clothes in this case that denote your status. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would also say it's about the economic status of your position within like society. It's a societal construct of how to determine value or within a society, and it's very interesting. Mostly the distinctions vary on the status of discrimination, I would say. Like the different categories are made up about these structural discriminations that are also embedded in racism and things like that. So it's a structural definition that helps identify also, I think, discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. So class is as much about economy or about owning property, money, etc., as it is about structural inequalities. And of course, as you just said, class is very much an intersectional kind of concept. So it always intersects with things like gender, race, age, etc., etc. And all of these may form different forms of inequalities, but also disadvantages, but also advantages. So if you're a man from a middle class background and you're white, you definitely have structural advantages instead of being a BIPOC woman of a working class background and being over the age of 55, you might run into structural inequalities and structural disadvantages that someone else might not have. So class, first of all, is intersectional. It always intersects with other identity categories such as gender, age, sexuality, etc., etc. Also, it's a structuring principle. So if we want to define class as a whole, it is a structuring principle within society that tells us a lot about our social positions and about the advantages and disadvantages we have as we go through or as we move through the social sphere in this case. The problem is, or when it comes to class, it's a very, and I think it's Wendy Botero who says it's a very slippery concept. We can't really define it, but there are certain markers that kind of put us to the definition of class. Also, recently especially, there have been arguments being made that class is actually not really important any longer. So going back through my studies, for instance, we talked a lot about race, we talked a lot, or ethnicity, we talked a lot about gender, but we rarely talked about class, simply because class is on the one hand a pretty slippery concept and it's very long or very complicated, so to speak, to trace it sometimes, but generally class wasn't really a thing, so to speak. And indeed, some scholars have argued that it is not a thing any longer because we live in a society without classes, and there's even one scholar that has said or has argued that Britain is, in a way, a society without classes, which I would definitely argue against. But what most of these scholars kind of note is that class differences have been superseded by things like commodification. The stuff we buy isn't exactly tied to class any longer. Maybe as a very strange example, or as a weird example perhaps, questions of fashion, for instance, what you wear isn't really tied to a class position any longer. Especially in the last couple of years, you have, fast fashion trends, which go very much with fashion trends. So the differentiation between something cheaply bought and something high quality isn't visible, at first glance any longer, which might have been visible a couple of years ago because simply those fashion trends weren't or didn't trickle down as fast. Also with buying knockoffs, for instance, these things do kind of level class differences simply because commodification has kind of superseded these class differences to some degree. I would definitely not agree with the idea that Britain is a classless society, and I would also potentially not agree with that class doesn't matter any longer. I would argue that class does matter just as much as ethnicity and gender do, both in university, for instance. So if you look at the Gleichstellungsbeauftragten at university, they often deal with racial inequalities. They do deal with gender inequalities, but they rarely deal with class inequalities, which I think is still a travesty because we need to be talking about that, because not everyone has the same advantages. You don't enter university, I'm not quite sure, maybe you have had the same experiences, but if you don't come from a middle class, lower middle class background, it's sometimes really hard to get into university because suddenly you're confronted with, you know, this is something you don't know. These are the classics you haven't read simply because you read something completely different as a child at home, simply because your parents might not have had the same educational background, and you suddenly realize, you know, how much you don't know. And it's not just about knowledge, but it's also about the way you behave, the way you move as a student, the way you do your studies. All of these things are class or are very much tied to class, and not talking about it is very, very problematic, I would argue. So I'm not quite sure, have you had similar experiences, or has there been one moment in your studies, for instance, or, you know, in your general life, where you really noticed class differences in a very particular manner? If it's too personal, then you don't have to answer, but just asking. Yeah.
Maybe, but that's just more of a general point. I do sometimes, because actually my main focus of study is American cultures, American culture studies. So I'm just a visitor in the British culture.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, and,
what was that about the empire coming back to roost? Sorry.
So it's interesting for me, I would say, this contrast, and I do feel that sometimes in these classes there's the focus on diversity studies, and sometimes I do feel it's not right that we all discuss diversity studies in a very homogenic environment. And I don't, as I said, it's like a general point. It's not like I'm the only one aware of it. We are aware of it. It's part of the discussions. But I don't feel like it's the best avenue to just like be aware of or try to be aware, but also like to really get those people also into those discussions, like having the opportunity. And it's so, I don't know, that's just my general point of sometimes in these kinds of classes that we are in, I do feel it's, because as we also talk about racism and these aspects, because you have to talk about them, but we are all
we're all white.
At least white passing. I don't know, I don't want to presume also, of course, but yeah. Yeah.
Same thing, we do talk about sexualities, but you know, you can't really, it's also very strange. I do have a sexuality class on Monday. It sounds like a sex ed class. It's not a sex ed class. Sometimes it can, you know, happen, but generally that isn't what we do. But most of what we talk about is very much heterosexual relationships. We rarely talk about sexualities, queer sexualities, simply because it's one of the things where you can really, really open a can of worms that you might not want to open in 90 minutes because you can't close it again. But also most people either perform straight passing relationships, are straight passing, or they do perform a particular kind of queer sexuality that I don't want to say that you can see, but that they certainly make you aware of. But generally, we do talk about heterosexual relationships, white people, and we do talk about very much middle class things. If we talk in British literature studies, if we talk about Thomas Hardy, or if we talk about D.H. Lawrence, these are usually upper class, middle class people within the novels, for instance. We rarely address working class lives, working class experiences. Something I found very, very weird, because I do come from a working class background. My parents had nothing to do with higher education. For them, that was completely out of reach. Also, they did grow up in the GDR, so working class wasn't exactly negative. It's not a negative comment or a negative class to be in. That was actually pretty good. But, you know, with the reunification, these things became or were put in much sharper focus. And there are structural inequalities that we rarely talk about, because we focus very much on the norm, which is the largest part of society, middle class, white, straight, etc., etc. So absolutely, that is one part where you notice it. I think I also noticed it with regards to language, and we'll get to that in a moment. And with regards to dialect, what is this? To dialect, of course. But when I think in my first semester, there was one professor, and I did a presentation in his class, and I thought it was a pretty good presentation. It's the first one in university. It's never really good, but it wasn't a complete mess, so I was kind of happy with it. And he was too. But then he said, or mostly to the effect, it was a good presentation, but if you want to get by in university, you need to get rid of your dialect. And I was like, what? And he said it sounded simple. And I've never felt more insulted than I did in this very moment, because at this point in time, I had never had a problem with dialect or anything. Of course, I noticed that everyone spoke differently, but I didn't really, you don't go in and go, oh my God, I'm super conscious of the way I speak. But after that, I was super conscious of the way I spoke, and I tried to refine this kind of dialect. But this is also not just a regional issue, but a class issue, because what his implication was that I did not fit the standard. The standard was a proper kind of German, which if you listen to professors, in English or in the English and American Studies department, that's of course different because we usually speak English, but generally people do have dialects. But there was the implication by that professor that you needed to hide it in some degree, because it kind of already marked you out not only as different but as lower class. And this was the implication. No, I could have come from a different, in this case he was obviously right, but even if I had come from a upper middle class background and still had the dialect, the implication would have immediately been, lower class. Also with that standard comes lower educational background, comes lower cultural capital. And this is where we jump straight in when we talk about class. Generally, as a definition perhaps, just need to switch for a second so that everyone else can see it. So if we talk about classes, we usually talk about a hierarchical structure of classes. And John Clark, for instance, notes that upper classes are sometimes the aristocracy, inbred to rule with natural authority. Middle classes are sometimes the bourgeoisie, involved in commerce or professions, who manage their breeding rationally and defer gratification. The lower classes are sometimes the laboring classes, lower orders, working class or dangerous and perishing classes, who simply breed too much. So there are always kind of implications when it comes to not only educational background, but when it comes to sexuality also. And just moving on, because I think the next slide is also about, no, that's not. So class, apart from being an ordering principle, is, as you've already noted, always something to do with economy, something to do with financial means. So Weber notes, and here I'm going to refer to Max Weber, so that's a pretty not outdated, but a old-ish definition. I'm going to criticize and deal with that in a moment, but he notes that class is the typical chance for supply of goods, external living conditions and personal life experiences as determined by the power or lack of such to dispose of goods or skills for income in a given economic order. So that means you have to have a certain educational background which you can then turn into income. If you're a farmer, you can obviously only go a certain way, but if you have a higher education background, for instance, you can turn that into a certain kind of income which you can then dispose. And this income generation and disposal of goods or property, for instance, kind of already points out your class position. Not going to read that, but generally also not going to read that. But even though that Weber, he does note at some point that class is a bit more than just income. He talks about social stratification, he talks about power and prestige. He does note that there is something else if you belong, for instance, to a certain group, and I think his examples are teachers, university professors, and military men. These kinds of things already point you towards not a certain class, but these kinds of prestige groups can supersede class differences. Not so much from the inside within these I don't want to call it case, but within these groups, but certainly from the outside. So being a military man already puts you, no matter whether you come from a working class background or not, already puts you in a certain social division, certain group. However, again, even though he notes that there are other things that kind of determine your class status, he already says that class as a whole is an economic concept. It is the position of individuals in the market that determines their class position, and it is how one is situated in the marketplace that directly affects one's life chances. So the way you move across class divides, for instance, whether you're being or whether you're enabled, so to speak, to move upwards in this case. And of course, as I said, you know, Weber he writes these kinds of ideas in the 1920s where class divisions are both stronger, but they're also much less defined and much more blurry, because you have those strong groups like military, like universities, where these class differences can be kind of superseded from the outside. But class is not just an economic concept. It is certainly important because our income does determine certain life chances. But, and this is where I'm going to move on to Bourdieu, and he notes that class is much more than just financial means and property. Because for Bourdieu, and I hope this is the second, oh no, that's not the one. But because for Bourdieu, it is basically, it's sort of interrelated concepts or certain parts that are interrelated. So what class or your class position does depend on is not just your income, but it's also your family name, where you come from, your social network, and I think you said there is a certain appreciation for things, a certain taste you have to have. And this is where he splits capital being just resources, where he splits that off in three different parts. The first one is economic capital, and that's kind of self-explanatory. It's the income you generate through your job, for instance. It's the income your family has had, so it's inheritance, for instance, but it's also property. So it is a difference whether you rent your flat or whether you have a flat, as in property, or whether your parents, for instance, have flats or houses, and so on and so forth. So this is economic capital, pretty much, again, self-explanatory. But then he kind of opens the idea of resources into social capital on the one hand and cultural capital on the other hand. And social capital, this is the first one that I'm going to sort of deal with. Social capital is and I'm quoting Bourdieu here, is the aggregate of the actual or potential resources which are linked to possession of a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. So by the way, Bourdieu, just as all the other theoreticians, is very wordy. Just as a, disclaimer. Or in other words, to the membership in a group which provides each of its members with the backing of the collectively owned capital, a credential which entitles them to credit in the various senses of the word. So if we go back to the Kingsmen circle in itself would be social capital. So what Eggsy doesn't know in the beginning of the movie is that he possesses actually quite a bit of not only of economic capital, but mostly social capital, because he, even though he doesn't quite know Harry Hart any longer, he knows Harry Hart, and Harry Hart comes with a certain background, comes with a certain group, the Kingsmen, comes with a certain class position, and simply by knowing him, Eggsy does possess social capital. He also possesses social capital in other forms. So he does have a family. So the family name, especially his father's name, does come in handy for him at some point. But he also has certain friends, certain networks. All of them in this case, or most of them in a working class background, but usually that is what social capital sort of goes with, or kind of denotes. It is your social relations that you form generally. Friendships, family, but also professional relationships. So these are for instance, institutionalized relationships of mutual recognition. That would be your boss and you, for instance, employee, employers, for instance. Yes?
But would you have a distinction between how much social, what was it called? Capital in the different classes, because also if you're working class, you maybe know everyone in your neighborhood, and you have like a quantity of social capital. So
very, very good point.
What is it about the influence one has?
Kind of. It's kind of both. It's a bit weird. So within your group, if you possess a lot of social capital, loads of the connections, no matter in which group you are, that makes you influential in that certain group. What Bourdieu kind of talks about is the idea of the entire social strata, so the entire society. And he notes that, of course, certain classes have different, on the one hand, access to social capital, and on the other hand, a different sort of amount of social capital. And what he notes is that the important part about these institutionalized relationships and these memberships is the question whether they can benefit you, whether they are so-called profitable. Yeah. So what he says is the profitability of certain, so what he sees relationships like is basically a transaction. You put work in. If you make friends, you put in work to, make time for them, do things with them. That all kind of requires time and work. And what he says is that you should get something out of it. You shouldn't just be friends, but that friendship should be beneficial to you in some sort of way. So he says that these things can be turned into other forms of capital, whether in education, that a friend of yours is potentially in a higher education system, for instance, and can teach you things, but also in the way that, the idea of vitamin B, having knowing certain people that can get you into certain places. This is part of the entire social capital. And he says the higher the social capital is, the higher the chance to turn these forms of relationships and these networks into something profitable for you, whether that's more social capital, even more people, but also in terms of income generation, or in terms of receiving cultural capital in forms of records or paintings or books. There's always the idea of profitability, not just, not a kind of transaction of I have friends, they're good for my mental health, but mostly I have friends and I could potentially use these relationships to get something out of it. And this is where Bourdieu says that working class people have a lower chance of turning their social connections, even though they might have high amounts of social capital, which is kind of weird to measure it, but they can't really turn it into other forms of cultural capital, maybe cultural capital, but certainly not economic capital. And in order to sort of rise through class ranks, for instance, they would need more income, which they can't sort of generate from their social capital. Okay, does make sense? Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so this is basically what social capital does. It's the question of how many people do you know and how much can you turn these relationships into something profitable for you. And then his third kind of capital, and I think that is one of the more fruitful lenses through which we can look at films, through which we can look at social relationships, is cultural capital. And cultural capital kind of exists in three states. On the one hand, there's the embodied state, which we'll get to in a moment. So the form of long-lasting dispositions of the mind and the body in the objectified state in the form of cultural goods, that is pictures, books, dictionaries, instruments, machines, etc., which are the trace or the realization of theories or critiques of these theories, problematics, etc., and in the institutionalized state as a form of objectification which must be set apart because, as will be seen in the case of educational qualifications, it confers entirely original properties on the cultural capital which it is presumed to guarantee. So, again, I don't know why he couldn't have said, institutionalized capital is your academic qualifications, your certificates, everything you earn in an institutionalized manner, all your degrees, that is institutionalized capital. And that is, of course, basically what Bourdieu means is that a sheet of paper has capital, a certain amount and a certain worth, a value is conferred to a blank sheet of paper that basically says Master of Education. Which in itself wouldn't mean anything, but there's this artificial relationship between value and this blank sheet or this sheet of paper that says your name and your degree. That's institutionalized capital. That's important simply because having higher amounts of it, of course, can turn these things into profit, can turn these things into beneficiary, or can that turn that into a certain kind of benefit. Then objectified state is, and here again I'm going to refer to Kingsmen, the scene we saw in or that I showed briefly in the beginning, where you see the Kingsmen tailor shop. This is objectified cultural capital, having all those oil paintings, those statues, and they're probably not cheap. They're not knockoffs, but they're, you know, the real deal, basically. You have those golden frames, you have the sort of Biedermeier furniture, you have the dark wooden panels, you have all the technology. All of that is objectified cultural capital, everything you own. If you have a picture, an oil painting in your house, in your flat, that is your cultural capital. All the books you possess, that's cultural capital. Everything that you can sort of buy and own. And cultural capital, in the sense of the objectified cultural capital, can of course be transferred. Institutionalized capital is usually very much focused on one person. You can't simply give someone else your degree and say, congratulations, you're now a Master of Education, even though it says my name. So that is very much an individualized kind of capital. And the embodied state, this is where things get actually really interesting, because what Bourdieu, and this is why his class theory is, in a way, he's not the first to say that class dispositions are written on the body and can be read off from the body. For instance, Norbert Elias also says that. He says that we civilize our bodies to a certain degree, and our bodies are being civilized, for instance, by our class dispositions and class locations. So I think he uses medieval or feudal times, basically, where he says that the cutlery you use was kind of indicative of your class status. If you used a spoon, that was usually, lower class. The kind of spoon you used, how you used it, how you hold your hands while using it, all of these determined your class position, or were determined by your class position, because you hadn't been taught differently. However, not Bourdieu, but Norbert Elias doesn't really go too much into class. He kind of only talks about the conditioning of the body. But Bourdieu says that your class disposition very much shapes the way you talk, you move, your tastes, your appreciation. So this is exactly the cultural capital. Is also about appreciating certain things. You can own a Pollock painting, but you might not appreciate it. Simply owning these things doesn't automatically infer cultural capital or an appreciation of these things, but it needs to be interconnected. So you need to be appreciative of these things while also owning them, for instance. I mean, there also says that you obviously have a lot of money in order to own one of these paintings. But anyways, so the embodied state, this is where Bourdieu's theory actually has some merit. I mean, it also has merit in other ways, but cultural capital in the embodied state is the one that is cited the most, because, and this is potentially a word you have already heard, class forms a habitus. Bourdieu has two kinds of theoretical frameworks for it. On the one hand, it's hexes, which is simply your corporal or your corporeality, the materiality, but he doesn't really use that word. He uses habitus, and habitus is very much something that is linked to the body, something that you are being taught, you are being socialized into. And I think I have that. Oh yeah, so cultural capital in and of itself is linked to the body, and the accumulation of cultural capital in the embodied state is what is called cultural cultivation, Bildung, and that presupposes a embodiment and incorporation. So what he argues basically is where you come from, the education you have, all of that is written in and of the body. So that is something you can immediately see. Which of course is a bit difficult, because if I go out like this, you probably don't see that I'm a university lecturer just from looking at me. Just as much as you would probably not see that you're a student, simply because fashion is very much class transcendent in some form. If I were to dress in a suit every day, that would probably already mark me out either as weird or as some kind of teacher or as a banker. I'm not quite sure. But generally, he argues that the way you dress, the way you appreciate dress, so it's not about wearing a suit, but it's about wearing, for instance, a bespoke suit or a tailored suit, so the quality of it is already indicative of your class status. It is a difference if I buy a very cheap H&M suit or if I buy something by, I don't know, Peek & Cloppenburg, and it's really tailored to my form. That is already a difference. It's the same kind of garment, but the class distinction is in the quality and the way I wear it, for instance. There's a difference if I wear Oxfords or Brogues in this case. And going or moving on to habitus, Bourdieu kind of notes that a habitus is a set of pre-conscious dispositions, including tastes, a sense of the self, bodily stances, and crucially skills or practical mastery. More specifically, habitus translates different class positions specified by different forms of capital into observable behavior. And I'm not quite sure how accurate that example is any longer, but have you ever had a closer look at the way, and because we're talking about the Kingsmen, I can potentially take that example, the way Ralph Fiennes moves. I mean, that is the question, how many films have you seen with him? But what is interesting, and this is something, I think I said that a couple of semesters ago, and someone wrote me afterwards and said, you've kind of ruined it for me because the only thing I'm doing is kind of tracing how he walks. But it's quite interesting because he comes from an upper class background, and the way he stands is usually his elbows out and his hands weirdly turned to the inside. He doesn't stand like this, but he has that kind of position. And once you notice it, you cannot unsee it, so you're welcome. But generally what is interesting is, and he said that in a kind of interview, I believe, that he was trained from an early stage on to walk properly. And this is something, this class position in this case, and this kind of education and socialization has been translated bodily in his bodily stance. Yeah.
You can also see it with people who lift, for example, or who box.
Yeah.
They always, I know people who are boxing and they're always walking like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Like a frame, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
So.
You also see that in ballet dances. You immediately see if someone dances kind of professionally or semi-professionally, because the way they walk is very different from the way you would, for instance, walk, simply by training. Although this is how certain professions are being written on the body, but there are, and this is what Bourdieu argues, it is dependent on how you were raised. So for instance, my grandmother was always the walk upright. She would always come to you and kind of touch you lightly on the shoulders if you weren't walking upright. So my brother and I, we kind of, every time we did this slouching kind of thing, she would immediately go and correct us slightly. And so you kind of learn to walk upright. There are also other things. There are certain trainings people or children go through, whether it's sit upright, don't do this, don't fidget, walk like this. You should also kind of have that cutlery, move it like so, and so on and so forth. Yes?
Yeah, for the training, you also have that with celebrities, for example. When they walk about normally, then they walk like us maybe, and like kind of slouchy or something, not like that. And when they walk on the red carpet, then they're like really like moving elegant and slowly and being like, hello, and so on.
Yeah.
And for the cutlery, you also have, I see it with people from not maybe upper working class or middle class. Some people hold their forks like the other way turned around and being like cutting like that, and then it's really funny to see the differences. I was at a wedding this weekend and I could see the differences, and it was like really like, wow.
It's actually interesting. Once you've seen it, you cannot stop looking for it.
Yeah.
That's why I started that once, because a friend of mine, he is also, my parents, maybe as a weirdly personal thing, they were very aspirational to middle class. And my grandparents in particular were very aware that in order to be considered working class, you had to behave like like middle class. So you had to properly, fork in one hand, knife in the other, and you had to cut properly, and you had to eat properly, you know, no chewing with your mouth open, etc., etc. And a friend of mine, especially, they would go with the spoon holding. So spoons were held like this, properly. You don't have it full and you don't shove it into your mouth, you sip delicately, so to speak. And a friend of mine holds his spoon like this, or like so.
Yeah.
And he kind of shovels everything into his mouth. And this is where I first noticed there was obviously a difference. I had never really noticed as a child that my parents or my grandparents were kind of aspiring to higher planes. But they were very aware of their working class status. They were very aware that in the ways or in the professions they worked in, they needed to portray a certain kind of image. So they trained us and my brother and I in a particular manner that we weren't really aware of. But once I saw a friend of mine eating like this, I thought, there is a difference. Because his parents, they didn't really care how their children ate. They weren't conscious of that there were some kind of table manners you had to adhere. That sounds like they ate like pigs. That wasn't the case, but they were certainly not as aware of these social strictures as other, also not just my family, but other families were. And this is what Bourdieu says. It's not, you know, with the starlets or the celebrities. They're kind of aware the moment they transcend or they shift into a different role. But what Bourdieu says is that these habitus thing, or the habitus, is a pre-conscious kind of thing. You don't consciously do that. You don't consciously choose to hold your cutlery in a certain way, at least before you become aware that there is, of course, a social kind of policing going on if you do it wrong. Is also, I think, one of the next quotes should say that. No, not that. But this is actually Norbert Elias, and he notes that jedes andere Verhalten, jede Durchbrechung der Verbote oder der Zurückhaltung in der eigenen Gesellschaft bedeutet eine Gefahr und eine Entwertung der Zurückhaltung, die ihm selbst auferlegt ist. So it's about the conditioning of the body and the social strictures that go along with it. Certain kinds of behaviors, certain kinds of bodily stances are allowed in certain classes, and some of them are not. Weirdly enough, I think it's the upper classes where all of that kind of transcends, because they can behave as they want, because simply their economic capital and their social capital protects them from some of the social policing that goes on in lower classes. But I think, and this is something that scholars have kind of agreed on, is that the middle classes in particular are very much aware that there is something above and something below. So they don't want to have the same kinds of behaviors of the lower classes, and they aspire to the upper classes, and they do upper class, even more upper class than upper classes would do that. So all of these kinds of real, of these social policing kinds of things come from middle classes usually. Yes?
I just wanted to add, I do feel that because you said like in the aristocracy or in the higher class there is not many as tight as the regulations of the middle class, but I do feel there is, because there's still one distinction made between like the old money and the new money.
Absolutely.
I do feel like the group of new money people, they really don't care about these kinds of restrictions. They are more free in their spending, they are bold, and they are like determined to be decadent in these kinds of things. But the aspect of old money, we were also talking about Downton Abbey before, so I think that also fits into this category of we have to present our old money qualities, because that is where the real value is. Not the money itself, but the tradition of the money.
Absolutely.
And, which of course then has its own aspect of colonialism tied to it, especially in the British context.
Absolutely. Also the Old Boys Network. These are networks that very much exactly, they're not only still prevalent, you see that in the Kingsmen, that is an old boys network. You only get in if you're basically recommended by someone who needs to be inside that network already. But in those old boys networks, and this is something you see with Arthur when he says, when there are certain regulations, when do they drink this 1815 bourbon, basically, when they drink it, how the ceremony and the rituals around it are being performed, that is very much, there are social strictures to that. But with the, as you said, the nouveau riche, basically, they are not beholden to these certain strictures as much as the old boys network, the middle classes, and even the lower classes. And I can see that we're already right on time, so to speak, which we didn't, or I didn't notice because of all the chairs moving around. I'd say we're going to see each other next week for the last session. I'm going to send around a link, or 2 links basically. One will be a feedback link, so there's an official channel by the TU Dresden, which I'm not going to use. I'm going to use, tailored to my seminars kind of feedback. And the other one will be, because we will be dealing with academic writing next week, and I just want to glean how you stand on that. So, where are your most common problems? We'll be talking very briefly maybe about presentations and about handouts, because that has become some kind of weird problem of something I've noticed, but we'll mostly talk about term papers and how you write them, etc., etc. But I'm going to send around a link where your problems lie, and then I'm going to address these problems specifically, because I can already see myself next week rambling on, and then we have 20 minutes left or so. Anyways, I wish you a good week. I'm going to see you next Tuesday for our last session, and up until that, have a good week.